Hello, everyone. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm Joe Firestone, your host. And my topics for tonight are: has the Reagan attack on the middle class ended? A tribute to Phil Donohue. Also, Down with Kings, which is an exhortation by Tom Hartman. And finally, an opinion piece on Harris's fight on price gouging and whether that is good economics or not. Okay, so here we go. D is here. Hello, D. Great to see you. I'm going to start off with the first of our pieces. It's a piece by Tom Hartman. And the title is the, quote, Reagan Revolution's, unquote, attack on America's middle class at an end, as it finally ended. And this was written on August 20th by Tom, so it's a few days old already. Here's a graphic. It appeared at the Hartman Report, which is Tom's blog. And there's a big dead end sign, which I suppose is saying that the attack on the middle class was a dead end. And hopefully it's dead ended. But anyway, Tom says, here at the Democratic Convention, speaker after speaker is pointing out how the Biden presidency and the Harris-Walz campaign are rewriting the economic rules of our country in an effort to bring back the middle class. As we stand at the edge of the end of the Reagan Revolution, an end signaled by one particular phrase in President Biden's speech early in his presidency, which I'll get to in a minute, says Tom. It is really important, that Americans understand the backstory. And now Tom goes into that backstory. Reagan and his conservative buddies intentionally gutted the American middle class. But they did so not just out of greed, but also with what they thought was a good and noble justification. As I lay out in more granular detail in my book, says Tom, The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, and The Hidden History of American Democracy, 3 books by Tom. Back in the early 1950s, conservative wealth that those people were accumulating. Was my stream interrupted here? I noticed that I was off the net for a moment. I hope not for too long. Anyway, if I've been off for a little while, rather than simply momentarily, please let me know. Oh, Evelina says yes. Maybe I'll go back a few steps then. Uh, a little ways. As I lay out in more granular detail in my books, because this is Tom Hartman, the hidden history of American oligarchy, the hidden history of neoliberalism, and the hidden history of American democracy, back in the early 1950s, conservative thinker Russell Kirk proposed a startling hypothesis that would fundamentally change our nation and the world. The American middle class was growing more rapidly than any middle class had ever grown in the history of the world. Okay, in terms of numbers of people in the middle class, the income of those people and the overall wealth that those people were accumulating. The middle class was growing in wealth and income back then, in fact, faster than the top 1%. Some Republicans believed that this was dangerous, perhaps even deadly to democracy itself, which in retrospect seems like a silly idea, since the danger to democracy of late has been coming from the extremely wealthy, of course, and did not come from the middle class. Kirk postulated in 1951 that if the middle class got too wealthy, we would see an absolute collapse of our nation's social order, producing chaos, riots, and possibly even the end of the republic. Keep in mind, nobody had ever seen a middle class as large and prosperous as did the USA in the 1950s and 1960s. Of course, I come from that middle class, and Tom Hartman did too. A few years later than myself. I think I'm a bit older than he is. But he's up there. He's certainly in his 70s or so. The first chapter of his 1951 book, The Conservative Mind, from Burke to Eliot, here he's referring to Russell Kirk's book, of course, is devoted to Edmund Burke, the British conservative who Thomas Paine debated in 1791 on his way to get arrested in the Revolution in France. Paine was so outraged by Burke's arguments that he wrote an entire book rebutting them, titled The Rights of Man. Burke was defending, among other things, Britain's restrictions on who could vote or participate in politics based on wealth and land ownership, as well as the British maximum wage that was explicitly designed to prevent the emergence of a large middle class. That's right, it was a maximum wage. And it was set pretty low. That was the idea. Burke and his contemporaries in the late 1700s believed that if working class people made too much money, they would challenge the social order and collapse the British form of government. So Parliament passed a law making it illegal for employers to pay people over a certain amount so as to keep wage earners right at the edge of poverty throughout their lives. For the outcome of this policy, read pretty much any Charles Dickens novel. Picking up on this, Kirk's followers argued that if the American middle class got too rich, there would be similarly dire consequences. Young people would cease to respect their elders. Women would stop respecting and depending on their husbands. And minorities would begin making outrageous demands and set the country on fire. When Kirk laid this out in the early 1950s, only a few conservative intellectuals took him seriously. People such as William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater were electrified by his writings and line of thinking. But Republicans like then-President Dwight Eisenhower said of people like Kirk and his rich buddies, quote, "Their numbers are negligible and they are stupid," unquote. That's what Ike had to say about them. And I was never a big Ike fan. I always thought that he was a little too conservative for my blood. And then came the 1960s. In 1961, the birth control was legalized, and by 1964 was in widespread use. This helped kick off the modern-day women's liberation movement as women, now in control of their reproductive capacity, demanded equality in politics and the workplace. Bra burning became a thing, at least in pop culture lore. By 1967, young people on college campuses were also in revolt. The object of their scorn was an illegal war in Vietnam that President Johnson had lied us into. Along with national protests, draft card burning was also a thing. And throughout that decade, African Americans were increasingly demanding an end to police violence and an expansion of civil and voting rights. In response to several brutal and well-publicized instances of police violence against black people, in the late 1960s, riots broke out and several of our cities were on fire, including Washington, D.C., of course, famously. These three movements, all hitting America at the same time, got the attention of conservatives and Republicans who had previously ignored or even ridiculed Kirk back in the 1950s. Suddenly he seemed like a prophet. The Republican/conservative, quote, solution, unquote, to the, quote, crisis, unquote. These three movements was put into place in 1981. The explicit goal of the so-called Reagan Revolution was to take the middle class down a peg and end the protests and social instability. I don't know if many people were aware of that when they voted for Reagan in 1980. I don't think their vote was based on wanting to take the middle class down a peg. I think their vote was based on a certain disgust, for Jimmy Carter, for allowing the inflation, high inflation and high employment, in his administration to have taken place. People, I think, were disgusted by that, and also disgusted by his response to the Iranian Revolution was it in 1978 or 1979? I forget. Their plan was to declare war on labor unions so wages could slide back down again, end free college all across the nation, so students would be in fear rather than willing to protest, and increase the penalties Nixon had already put on drugs so they could use those laws against hippie anti-war protesters and black people. Wonderful motives, right? As Nixon's right-hand man, and of course here we're talking about the early 1970s, John Ehrlichman told reporter Dan Baum, quote, "You want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Quote again, "We knew that we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." And quote again, "We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did," unquote. While it looks from the outside like the singular mission of the Reagan Revolution was simply to help rich people and giant corporations get richer and bigger, the ideologues driving the movement actually believed they were helping to restore safety and stability in the United States, both politically and economically. Oh, how wrong they were. The middle class was out of control, they believed, and something had to be done. Looking back at the, quote, solutions, unquote, England used around the time of the American Revolution and advocated by Edmund Burke and other conservative thinkers throughout history, they saw a solution to the crisis that also had the pleasant side effect of helping their biggest donors, and thus boosting their political fortunes. Reagan massively cut taxes on rich people and raised taxes on working class people 11 times, all to reduce the economic and political power of the, quote, dangerous, unquote, middle class that then was around 2/3 of us. For example, I think now we're somewhere in the 30s of the middle class. I think they have cut it in half now. For example, he put a tax on Social Security income and unemployment income and put in a mechanism to track and tax tips income, all of which had previously been tax-free. Tips were rarely monitored, but were exclusively needed and used by middle-class people. He ended the deductibility of credit card, car loan, and student debt interest, overwhelmingly claimed by working-class people. I remember that. I used to claim those. At the same time, he cut the top tax bracket for billionaires and multimillionaires from 74% to 25%. There were only 13 billionaires in America then, in large part because of previous tax policies. The modern explosion of billionaires followed Reagan's massive tax cuts on the morbidly rich. He declared war on labor unions, crushed PATCO, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, in less than a week. And over the next decade, the result of his war on labor was that union membership went from about a third of the American workforce when he came into office to around 13% at the end of the Reagan-Bush presidencies. It's at around 11% of the private workforce now. He and Bush also husbanded the moribund 1947 General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which let Clinton help create the WTO, and NAFTA, which Clinton signed and thus opened a floodgate for American companies to move manufacturing overseas, leaving American workers underemployed while radically cutting corporate labor costs and union membership. Sure enough, Reagan's doubling down on the war on drugs was successful in shattering black communities. And of course, then the crime bill of 1994, that was written by Joe Biden. This succeeded in putting huge numbers of blacks into prison. His war on labor cut average inflation-adjusted minimum and median wages by more than over a couple of decades than anybody had seen since the Republican Great Depression of the 1920s and 1930s. And his war on colleges jacked up the cost of education so high that an entire generation is today so saddled with more than $1.5 trillion in student debt that many aren't willing to jeopardize it all by acting up on campuses, acting up, quote unquote, on campuses. To this, I have to comment. When I went to college in the period from 1955 to 1960, that is, I took a semester off, somewhere in the middle of those. My tuition at Cornell University, one of the Ivy League colleges, was $500 a semester, $1,000 a year, which was affordable for a good part, of the middle class. The key to selling all this to the American people, of course, I worked also during summers. That helped out some. The key to selling all this to the American people was the idea that the U.S. shouldn't protect the rights of workers, subsidize education, or enforce civil and voting rights laws because, quote, conservatives, unquote, said, government itself is a remote, dangerous, and incompetent power that can legally use guns to enforce its will. They added that when people, quote, get things from government, unquote, they become, quote, dependent on government, unquote, and end up intergenerationally, quote, lazy, unquote. As Reagan told us in his first inaugural, government was not the solution to our problems, but instead was the problem itself. He ridiculed the formerly noble idea of service to one's country and joked that uh, there were really no good people left in government, because if they were smart or competent, they'd be working in the private sector for a lot more money. And in fact, private sector salaries at that time were going up, and people were getting paid a lot more money in the private sector, especially on Wall Street, than they were in the government. He told us that the 9 most frightening words in the English language were, quote, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," unquote. To sell this to the American people throughout the 1970s and 1980s, billionaires associated with the Republicans built a massive infrastructure of think tanks and media outlets, including newspapers, over 1,500 right-wing radio stations, and multiple TV networks and chains of TV stations to promote and amplify this message. It so completely swept America that by the 1990s, even President Bill Clinton was saying things like, I don't know why the even is in there, but President Bill Clinton was saying things like, quote, "The era of big government is over," unquote, and quote, "This is the end of welfare as we know it," unquote. Limbaugh, Hannity, and their right-wing radio talkers were getting millions a year in subsidies from groups like the Heritage Foundation. Fox News today carries on the tradition. Here, I have to comment that what accompanied this particular movement was the end of the political power of liberalism here in America. What the right wing did is, starting in the 1970s, the right-wing radio and press began to give the people who were liberals, a bad name. They said all kinds of outrageous and untrue things about liberals during this period of time. And they gave liberals a very bad reputation. And so office holders who were liberal began to run away from that particular the label. While liberals had been very popular and very effective during the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, and while that label was a noble sort of label, at that time, and many people were liberal, in many cases, the most active, of the liberals, were just short, of socialists. In fact, one of the main liberals at the time, J.K. Galbraith, that is John Kenneth Galbraith, Jamie Galbraith's father, who had been one of the leading liberals during the Second World War and just after, by 1972, was admitting that he was a socialist. So that the border between socialism, and liberalism, up to that time had kind of, was starting to fade away. But during the 1970s, that all changed. And by the 1980s, you found people were no longer referring to themselves as liberals, but were going back to the progressive label. And all through the 80s and 90s, more and more people were running away from the liberal label and becoming progressives. And so now in our politics, we have the progressives, and we have the conservatives, but we no longer have the liberals. Instead, we have the neoliberals, and the neoliberals, of course, in both parties are highly business-oriented and highly conservatives, and nothing like, the liberals of old. the mantle of liberalism has been picked up by the progressives among us, of course. Going on with the article, which brings us to President Joe Biden's 2021 speech that began the largest political and economic transformation of America since 1933. Probably the most important thing he said in that speech was almost completely ignored by the mainstream American press. It didn't make a single headline anywhere. Yet President Biden said something that Presidents Clinton and Obama were absolutely unwilling to say. So deeply ingrained was the Reagan orthodoxy about the dangers of, quote, big government, unquote, during their presidencies. President Biden said, quote, we need to remember the government isn't some foreign force in a distant capital. No, it's us, all of us, we the people, unquote. Well, I don't know about that, but it is true that if the government were operating right, and were run right, it would be being directed by us, by all of us, by we the people. The problem is that it's become the servants of the oligarchy, and we're fighting over control of the government. We're fighting with the oligarchy. That is what's going on today. This was an all-out declaration of war, going back to the article, on the underlying premise of the Reagan Revolution and a full-throated embrace of the first three words of the Constitution, quote, we the people, unquote. And now Vice President Harris and Governor Walz have carried on Biden's turn away from Reagan's and Clinton's neoliberalism, and similarly embraced, he should have mentioned Obama here, because Obama's neoliberalism was there too, and similarly embraced FDR's Keynesian economics that built the American middle class. Well, to some degree, they're embracing Keynesian economics, but to some degree also that is fading into an understanding of MMT economics, at least over a period of time. That understanding still falls way short of where we want it to be, but elements of MMT have crept into the Democratic Party, and I think you'll see more elements of MMT if the Democrats should win in 2024. And if the Greens should win, which I know is a very low probability at this point, but if the Greens should win, important elements of the Green campaign this year, specifically Jill Stein herself and her campaign manager, Jason Cole, especially Jason Cole, are, I would characterize Jason Cole as an MMT person. Okay, and I believe Jill Stein is quite friendly to MMT at this point. Going further, in March 1933, Franklin Roosevelt talked about the, quote, mysterious cycle in human events. He correctly identified the end of the Republican orthodoxy cycle of the 1920s, embodied in the presidencies of Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, of deregulation, privatization, and tax cuts. Warren Harding in 1920 successfully ran for president on two slogans. The first was, quote, a return to normalcy, unquote, which meant dropping Democratic President Woodrow Wilson's 90% tax bracket down to 25%, something Harding did in his first few years in office before, of course, he was assassinated. Second was, quote, less government in business, more business in government. In other words, deregulate and privatize. These actions, of course, brought us the Great Depression of 1929. Well, first, the boom of the 1920s, but later the Depression, the Great Crash of 1929. And what was known for two generations as the Republican Great Depression. Sometimes it was known as the Hoover Great Depression. So Americans are now watching for the third time in just 30 years a Democratic president clean up the economic and social debris of a prior Republican presidency. They're starting to figure out that crushing the middle class didn't produce prosperity and stability, but instead destroyed tens of millions of people's lives and dreams. And they're seeing the hollowness of Republicans' promises as we all watch aghast as the Trump fans campaign scrambles to mobilize the last remnants of its billionaire and white racist base, at the same time waging an all-out war on the ability of black, young, and working-class people to vote. President Biden's speech, I do want to comment on that also. It's often said, that it's Democrats that are rigging elections. And truth to tell, they have rigged the primary elections in their parties and have been hierarchically determining who will be their candidates. So democracy has little role in their selection of candidates. This was, of course, true in 2016, true in 2020, and very true in 2024. So the Democrats have been highly undemocratic in the way they run their party and select their candidate for president. On the other hand, it's the Republicans who have been highly undemocratic in waging an all-out war on the ability of black, young, and working-class people to vote. And that is the truth. And that doesn't get mentioned enough in the mainstream press. All we hear about is how undemocratic, the Democrats are. And that matters a lot. But it also matters a lot that the Republican Party is waging an all-out war on the ability of black, young, and working-class people to vote. Going on with the article. President Biden's speech was the beginning of the end for the Republicans, although it appears only a few of them realize it. And he doubled down on it in his brilliant presentation at the DNC last night, saying of Reagan's neoliberal experiment, quote, "Even a lot of Democrats thought it would work, but it didn't," unquote. This truly is a new day, in America. As they roll out new economic policies this week, President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz are driving a stake through the heart of the GOP's 44-year war against the middle class. Let's hope the damage Republicans have done over the last 4 decades isn't so severe that America can't be brought back from the brink of chaos and desperation. Right now, things are looking pretty good, although we can never forget that Hillary Clinton was 12 points above Trump with 50% popularity versus Trump's 38% in the polls just 2 weeks before the 2016 election. Well, I think the polls were wrong in that election, of course. They may have adjusted some of their so-called science since that time. They may not be as badly off now. I hope they're not as badly off because Democrats don't have much of a lead right now. We can't relax until after Election Day. Hopefully it's a new day, in America, and it will be if we show up, this fall. Tom, of course, is a vote blue no matter who Democrat, and is always in the Democrats' corner. He has been in the corner of the Democrats even through the years when they were all neoliberal Democrats. He himself is a progressive, but he's still in the corner of the Democrats. He's never gone further than the two-party system. But right now, the third parties have not done well so far this year. The Kennedy campaign, as we know, is suspended now and aborted. And Kennedy has come out for Trump, of course, at least in the battleground states. He said he's withdrawing from the ballot, on the battleground states. And in the non-battleground states, the other 40 states, he says he's still contesting the election and he wants people to vote for him. But I don't think that people are going to vote much for him in the other 40 states when he's withdrawn from the battleground states. So even the slim chance to win that he had is now completely gone. So, of course, he has joined Trump in hopes that he gets control, of HHS, and in hopes that whatever Trump has promised him, it's a promise that Trump, is going to keep. Of course, I think this is extremely foolhardy, and foolish, and a very bad way to try to build his We the People party for the future. I think he needed to stay in the battleground states, to do that, and that his thinking was very quixotic. Anyway, again, we can't relax until after Election Day, Tom says. Hopefully it's a new day, in America, and it will be if we show up this fall. Tom means if we show up this fall, for Democrats. I am as yet unpersuaded and unconvinced. There are a few good signs from the Kamala Harris campaign. We are still not seeing any signs, of Medicare for all. We are not seeing any signs of aggressive action on the climate, as yet. We are seeing some good policies that, if they do get through the Congress, they would be good for people, better for people. We seem to be seeing, a desire, at least from the Kamala campaign, to try to rein in the control, of big business and business in general through strengthening the regulatory function of the federal government. But of course, that faces problems, enormous problems, because the Supreme Court is against regulation and is striking, at regulation, as it did in the Loper-Bright case, a case that cut out the legs, from regulation, unless the Loper-Bright decision is repealed by a Harris-Walz, administration. But, of course, they're not even talking Loper-Bright yet. They're talking about how they're going to regulate, and they're talking about being tougher, as we shall see a bit later, but they're not really outlining how they're going to be able to make it stick. They're certainly not talking about the biggest thing they can do to make it stick is to go get the filibuster on the first day of the Senate. If they don't get rid of the filibuster, a lot of their plans are going to go for naught. And of course, they have to pass also the Voting Rights Acts and the John Lewis Act, and I forget what the other act is called. Both of those have to be passed, though, and a whole raft of bills have to be passed to overcome all the terrible decisions of the Supreme Court. And that's not going to happen unless the Democrats get rid of the filibuster, on the first day of the new Congress, even before the president is sworn in. So I just want to throw some cold water on things here and indicate how important that is going to be to fulfill either the plans of Kamala Harris or the plans of Jill Stein. None of that is going to happen if we still have the filibuster. So I'll end the treatment of this there and move on to my second piece. But first, I'm going to check your comments. I see we have a pretty good group here tonight. Hi, folks. Evelina waves. Lana says no. Reagan's damage wasn't visible until much later. It was pretty visible to me by the early 1980s, I thought. Steve Wolpert said, hi, Kay. And Kay said, hi, Steve. Hi, Kay. We haven't seen you for a while. Glad you're back. And Lana Dell says, Reagan and, oh, I know why you're back tonight, because I'm covering two Hartman things. You love Tom Hartman, right? Reagan ended free college on the state level in California as a governor, per my friend from Sacramento. Oh, you mean Robert, of course. Reagan started out more left. Nancy Pants then started advising him. Everything went downhill. Oh, you think it was Nancy Pants's fault, huh? Steve Wilprin said, I think Nancy was into astrology. Yes, Social Security tax, thank you. Wasn't entirely sure if that was him. What a turd. Well, remember, the Social Security tax was increased and passed with the great help of the Speaker of the House, who was Tip O'Neill, okay, at that time. And Tip and Reagan made their deal, okay, on the golf course, okay, somewhere. And Tip was every bit as much of a turd as Reagan was. I'm very sorry. And Evelina said, what dastards? Yeah, turn the D into a B, and I agree with you. And Lana said, Steve into astrology is an understatement. Kay says, Reagan closed all the state mental hospitals, and I lost the best job I ever had in Ohio. Yeah. And a lot of people who should have been in the mental hospitals were wandering the streets after that and were homeless. That was the origin of the homeless problem in the United States. Brandy says, hey, guys, Bill Clinton was responsible for moving the D Party to the right. They now call themselves new or third-way Democrats. Bad, bad, bad. I don't know if they call themselves New Democrats anymore, but just simply Democrats. They took over the damn party. And the show Mac Shooty says, hey, yo. And Lana says, everyone, please hit the like button and share. Steve says, liked and shared. Evelina says, with their hidden agendas back in the 70s, all too visible to us now. Steve Wolfbrand says, but never Kamala. I take it, Steve, that you're going to go for Jill Stein then. And Steve says, RFK would like to get 5% in blue and red states. Yes, I know. But that wouldn't be enough to get him 5% across all the states, which is what he needs to get his party up there and get them on the ballot come 2028. Is it true Trump offered Bobby Kennedy to be CIA chief? I have no idea. I think Bobby wants more to be the HHS chief, so he can implement his ideas about health care. But as Robert Reich found when he was Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration, that it's one thing to be given, a cabinet post, and it's another not to be interfered with by the rest of the administration. That's a completely different thing. Lana says, Tom has great info on healthcare and some other areas, but he mostly criticizes Trump and GOP. But not enough criticism of the Democrats who paved the road that brought us Trump. You bet. And who have still been paving the road that brought us Trump. If the Democrats had been much better at the beginning of the Biden administration, we would not now be looking at a return of Trump. Had they gone through with the three elements of Biden's plan, and admittedly it was tough for them to do it because of the opposition by the Republicans, but also there were some Democrats who were constantly defecting to the Republican side. But if they had passed the whole Biden program, Trump would be nowhere now. Biden could have retired in peace. There would be no danger of Trump at all. Steve Wolfbrand said, smash the like button. Thank you, Steve. Do smash the like button. Evelyn says, far from Medicare for all. Isn't Kamala talking about expanding Obamacare? Baptizing it was a new name, of course. Yes, she's talking about it, but in some ways, she's talking about bringing it closer to Medicare for all in certain ways. I forget what she calls it. Probably Kamala Care. Evelyn says, was thinking about Kay today. I swear. Good you're back, Kay. Robert Copeland says, my first election I could vote in was when Reagan became president. Hello, Robert. Kay says, hi, Robert. If we want to see RFK back in the White House in 2028, perhaps we should take his advice. No, I don't want to see RFK in the White House in 2028. I don't see RFK in the White House. RFK has, do I have to go through my list of 7 things that are wrong with RFK? No, I don't want, I think RFK has been a big bust from my point of view. And I speak as a person who signed his petition to get on the ballot here in Virginia. And by the way, I'm pretty sure he will be on the ballot here in Virginia as well. So I could vote for him, but no way I'm going to. No way I'm going to. Robert Copeland says, hi, everybody. Hi, Robert. So, off to our second piece, which is about Phil Donahue, who just died, a few days back. This is a piece by Jeff Cohn, who was very close to Phil Donahue. I think it's by Jeff Cohn. Let me see if I remember correctly. Phil Donahue changed my life and millions of others. Rest in peace, Phil. Yes, it's by Jeff Cohn. Phil Donahue made his mark on our society. He fought for the underdog. He did it with style and grace and a wonderful sense of humor. Jeff Cohn, updated August 19, 2024. The original was written on August 19th, 2024. And there's a picture of Phil, a little older, but nevertheless jolly and smiling. Phil Donahue passed away Sunday night after a long illness. He was beloved by those who knew him and by many who didn't. He started as a local reporter in Ohio, was a trailblazer in bringing social issues to a national audience as a daytime broadcast TV host. Then he was pretty much banished from TV by MSNBC because he accurately, correctly, and morally questioned the United States, the horrific U.S. invasion of Iraq. In the 1970s, of course, Phil was right about that, wasn't he? We now know. In the 1970s, Phil took progressive issues and mainstreamed them to millions through his syndicated daytime show. He was a pioneer in syndication. He also pioneered on the issues. His most frequent guests on his daytime show were Ralph Nader, Gloria Steinem, and Reverend Jesse Jackson. They appeared dozens of times as Phil boosted civil rights, women's rights, consumer rights. He regularly hosted Dr. Sidney Wolf, warning of the greedy pharmaceutical industry and unsafe drugs. Raised a Catholic, he also featured advocates for atheism. Mainstream media obits would likely focus on his daytime TV episodes that included male strippers or other titillation. But Phil was serious about the issues and did far more than most of the mainstream TV journalists to address the bigger issues. I was a senior producer, says Jeff Cohn, on Phil's short-lived MSNBC primetime show in 2002 and 2003. It was frustrating for us to have to deal with the men Phil called the suits, quote unquote, NBC and MSNBC executives who were intimidated by the Bush administration and resisted any efforts by NBC/MSNBC to practice journalism and ask tough questions of Washington before our young people were sent to Iraq to kill or be killed. Ultimately, Phil was fired because, as the leaked internal memo said, Donohue represented, quote, a difficult public face for NBC at a time of war, unquote. But before we were terminated, we put guests on the screen who were not commonly on mainstream TV. We offered a full hour with Barbara Ehrenreich on Labor Day 2002, a full hour with Studs Terkel, Congress members Bernie Sanders and Dennis Kucinich, columnist Molly Ivins, experts like Phyllis Bennis and Laura Flanders, Palestinian advocates including Hanan Ashrawi. No one on U.S. TV cross-examined Israeli leaders like Phil did when he interviewed then Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres and later former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. They seemed stunned, never having faced such questioning from a U.S. Journalist. But, quote, the suits are show.
Welcome, LA.
Sorry. But the suits ruined our show. I should have said this came from Los Angeles progressives. But, quote, the suits, unquote, ruined our show when they took control and actually mandated a quota system favoring the right wing. If we had booked one guest who was anti-war, we needed to book two that were pro-war. If we had one guest on the left, we needed two on the right. When a producer suggested booking Michael Moore, known to oppose the impending Iraq war, she was told she needed to book three right-wingers for political balance. Amazing. 3 weeks before the Iraq war started and after some of the biggest anti-war mobilizations the world had ever seen, which were barely covered on mainstream TV, the suits at NBC/MSNBC terminated our show. Okay, there's a video of Jeff Cohn talking with Sharon Kyle, and is his first name Tom Kyle? I think so. Phil was a giant, okay, a huge celebrity who supported uncelebrated indie media outlets. He loved and supported the Progressive Media Watch group, FAIR, which I founded in the middle of the 1980s. And when he says supported, I think he means that Phil financially supported FAIR. Phil put Noam Chomsky on mainstream TV. He fought for Ralph Nader to be included in the 2000 presidential debates. He went on any TV show right after 9/11 that would have him to urge caution and to resist the calls for vengeful, endless warfare that would pointlessly kill a large number of civilians in other countries. He opposed active wars and the Cold War with the Soviet Union. He supported war veterans and produced an important documentary on the topic, quote, Body of War, unquote. Phil Donahue made his mark on our society. He fought for the underdog. He did it with style and grace and a wonderful sense of humor. He changed my life, okay, and others' lives. He was inspired by the consciousness-raising groups he saw in the feminist movement, and he sought to do consciousness-raising on a mass scale. Using mainstream corporate TV, he did an amazing job of it. That's what Jeff had to say about Phil, okay, on his death. I have to say, I was not that much into Phil. I'm not sure why, but he always struck me as weak on the economic end of things. Uh, okay, I guess that's why I didn't much watch his show. When I did watch it, okay, I liked it. I certainly did. I admired his courage. And of course, I regretted it when he was thrown off of mainstream TV. And I admired, of course, uh, his continued willingness to fight, okay, and to non-conform. And he certainly was outstanding for the time in his fight against uh, the social aspects of neoliberalism and the political aspects, okay, of neoliberalism. So that was my personal opinion, okay, of Phil. Having said that, I think Jeff Cohn has been doing a tremendous job, okay, over many years in fighting against, okay, the neoliberal trends in our society. Okay, anyway, I mourn Phil Donohue's death. Uh, I think that we all should be remembering him and giving him credit for the very good things that he did. And that's my commentary on that. Further comments? Lana says, yes, please go through your list. I don't know if I have time to go through my list, but I may go through it before the end of the show. Or I'll go through it, okay, in some other show. Next week, I may devote a program, okay, to Robert Kennedy. But Robert says, I intend to go after the big corporations who are ruining the country. I'm so glad of that, Robert. I intend to do that too. And Brandy says, my first election, I voted for Nader in 2000. R.I.P. said Steve Wolfbrand. K. Ryan said share. Lana says, I absolutely loved the Phil Donahue show. And K. Ryan said, me too, Lana. So, let's go on to the next piece. I wanted you to mention, yeah, Jesse Ventura and Phil were thrown off of MSNBC. Yes, Jesse Ventura was thrown off of MSNBC too. And that was a sad thing because Jesse always told the truth as he saw it, and he still does to this very day. And it was a scandal when he was thrown off of NBC. For that matter, it was a scandal when Ed Schultz was thrown off of MSNBC also. Through the years, a lot of wonderful people have been thrown off, okay, of MSNBC. Chris Hayes probably would have been thrown off, okay, of MSNBC, but he decided he had a young child and he wanted to conform and he wanted to make, I forget how much it is for Chris Hayes, but I'm sure it's at least $500,000 a year. One day, Chris will have enough money in the bank that he will probably be freed from concern about continuing with MSNBC. And we might see the second coming of Chris Hayes someday, okay, in independent media. Can't believe Ventura endorsed Kamala, though. Well, of course, I think Jesse Ventura understands the danger, okay, from Donald Trump, and he also understands that Jill has very little chance to win, and so he's making a choice. It's a difficult choice. I'm not quite ready to make it myself yet. I want to see much more, okay, from Kamala. I think Jesse probably should have waited to make his endorsement and see what else she's going to do. Okay. In particular, I think one thing that Kamala has to do right now is she has to break with Joe. And she has to oppose, okay, the genocide promptly and clearly. Sandy Dakers, join us. Hi, Sandy. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for coming. And Brandy says, there is no way in hell I will vote for Kamala. Okay. Uh, Steve says, Jesse said he wants a woman president. Very disappointing. Yes, he did say that, but he also said quite a lot of true things about Donald Trump. Brandy says Kamala won't do that, though. Maybe not. If she doesn't do that, she stands a good chance of losing to Trump, I think. And I think she'll consider that carefully. If she thinks the election is getting away from her and she needs Michigan and Minnesota and maybe Pennsylvania too, then maybe she'll do that. We shall see. What we shall see. Anyway, the next piece is another Thom Hartmann piece. I found it a very good and enjoyable one. Down with the Kings. SCOTUS presidential protection must go. You know, I very much share this opinion because I've talked about it here. It's supported by more than half the Democrats in the Senate, along with independents, Bernie Sanders and Angus King. Not a single Republican had the courage or patriotism to sign on to it. I think what he's talking about is the bill introduced by Chuck Schumer to repeal the immunity decision of the Supreme Court. There's Trump with a kingly crown on his head, looking every bit like, let's say he's striking a Mussolini pose. It's a Mussolini pose. Republicans this week asked the Supreme Court to throw 40,000 Arizona voters off the voting rolls. This is not the sort of case that the framers of the Constitution meant for the court to be deciding. For the past few decades, since right-wingers took over the court, it's been regularly overstepping its charter. Similarly, Donald Trump's criminal attempt to overthrow our government on January 6th is now back before Judge Tanya Chutkan's court, although whatever decision she renders will instantly be appealed by Trump's lawyers back to his friends on the Supreme Court. Tragically, justice will be a long time coming. And it will never come if he wins. It will never come if he wins, because the Justice Department, his Justice Department, will not prosecute him while he's the president. And given his age and state of health, he's likely to die while in the presidency. And now Senator Chuck Schumer and Congress want to do something about it. When the 6 corrupt and well-bribed Republicans on the Supreme Court gave Donald Trump immunity from prosecutions for crimes he committed while president, they not only, quote, broke, unquote, the law, but defied the Constitution itself. Now, it's not simply Tom who is saying this. Famous judges, or famous lawyers, and a judge in one case, but in the other, In the liberal case, it's Lawrence Tribe who says that he broke the law and defied the Constitution itself. And in the conservative and Federalist Society case, it was Judge J. Michael Luttig. That is to say, Luddig. I can't even say his name. I do like him, though. He's had a lot of courage in carrying the torch for the Constitution and against Trump from the conservative side. And he believes as well that the Supreme Court broke the law and defied the Constitution itself. This offense to our republic's rule of law demands reversal, and Congress is the only venue where that can be done. In this case, the Republicans on the court created a new doctrine of presidential immunity out of thin air. Not only is this a violation of American law, but it also contradicts the authorities the Constitution gave the court, as Justice Sonia Sotomayor pointed out in her dissent, see below. It is quite literally unprecedented, a massive power grab, and a corruption of our Republican Constitution. There is a remedy, but to understand it, you must first understand the nature and constitutional powers of the court itself, as I lay out in detail in the hidden history of the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America. While the Constitution created the House, Senate, and the presidency and vice presidency, its authors left the definition of the size, nature, and budget of the Supreme Court to Congress itself. The Supreme Court didn't even come into being until Congress passed a law defining it. From Article 3, Section 1, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish, unquote. By the way, if Congress created the inferior courts, Congress can destroy the inferior courts. If Congress had created the Supreme Court, well, I don't know about this one, but I suggest it may be able to destroy this Supreme Court and create another, and with that, all its justices, and create another Supreme Court with entirely new justices in it. Thus, on September 24, 1789, Congress created the Supreme Court via the Judiciary Act of 1789. If the Supreme Court was created by an act of Congress, it can certainly be repealed by an act of Congress, or it can be changed by the Congress in any way the Congress wants. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that the Supreme Court of the United States shall consist of a Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices, says, any 4 of whom shall be a quorum, and shall hold annually at the seat of government 2 sessions. Not only was the Supreme Court to be the creation of Congress, but the framers of the Constitution further specified that it was to operate directly under the supervision and regulation of Congress itself, which even had the power to define entire areas of law where the Supreme Court could be forbidden from ruling. Per Article 3, Section 2, quote, this is, of course, the exceptions clause in the Constitution, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make, unquote. This was because the framers of the Constitution wanted the court to be the weakest, least powerful branch of our government, for the simple reason that its members being appointed and for life at that, it is the only branch entirely unaccountable to we the people. Contemplate that for a moment. In his and Madison's sales pitch for the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton on May 28, 1788, wrote in Federalist 78 that the courts, including the Supreme Court, were the weakest of the three branches created by the Constitution. After all, at that time, it wasn't envisioned that they would ever have the power to strike down laws passed by Congress or create law or policy out of thin air, like saying the president has immunity from prosecution for crimes. And quote again, the judiciary is beyond comparison. This is a quote from Hamilton, Federalist 78. It's beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power, unquote, he wrote, adding in the same sentence that, quote, I guess this is not a quote from Federalist 78. Part of it is a quote from Federalist 78. The rest of it is from Tom himself, adding in the same sentence that, quote, it can never attack with success either of the two branches, either of the other two branches, unquote. But it has attacked them. It's attacked the power of Congress, okay? And in this instance, by conferring immunity on the president, meaning that the president is not subject to Congress's laws anymore as long as he is the president. He can violate Congress's laws with impunity and immunity. He even footnoted that sentence with a quote from the famous French judge, Montesquieu, who had first famously articulated the idea of a separation of powers between governmental branches as a check and balance. Hamilton's footnote read, quote, the celebrated Montesquieu, speaking of them, says, of the three powers above mentioned, the judiciary is next to nothing, unquote. Don't tell that to the Republicans on the court, however. After years of stroking and bribes from right-wing billionaires, they've come to think of themselves as the true kings and queens of America rather than mere servants of the Constitution and our nation's legal processes. Consider, for example, that notorious partisan liar, Sam Alito, when a year ago, July, he wrote in the Wall Street Journal, quote, no provision in the Constitution gives Congress the authority to regulate the Supreme Court, period, unquote. That is directly contradictory with the text of Article 3, Section 2, Clause 2. Or 2 weeks ago's absurdity when Neil Gorsuch had the audacity to warn President Biden, who had just proposed a binding code of ethics for the Supreme Court as well as term limits, that he should, quote, be careful, unquote. And what do you mean, be careful? He was just given immunity by the Supreme Court. He could go arrest all the justices of the Supreme Court tomorrow in his official capacity as president, and he would be immune based on their decision. He could clap them all in jail and prosecute them for treason against the Constitution. And there would be nothing the Supreme Court could do about it by virtue of their own stupid presidential immunity decision. As noted above, the Constitution did not create the Supreme Court. It merely identified it and authorized Congress to bring it into being. It did this on September 24th, 1798, about half a year after the first Congress was sworn into office on March 4th, 1798, and George Washington was sworn into office on April 30th, 1798, when Congress also simultaneously created the rest of the federal court system. Amazing, right? So late, 1798, so late after the Constitution was ratified. How was the Constitution finally ratified, in 1790? Or was it 1789? I forget. Okay. But the first election of George Washington was in 1792 as the president. And there was no Congress until March 4th of 1798. And no Supreme Court until a half year after that. Even worse, there is not a single place in the Constitution where the Supreme Court is authorized to either create or strike down laws. Creating laws or policy for the United States is an authority given exclusively to Congress, and it is. All laws must originate, in fact, with the House of Representatives because they're elected every 2 years and thus, quote, closest to the people, unquote. Then go to the Senate and generally only became law with the approval signature of the president. I don't think that's quite in the Constitution. I think all money laws, the power of the purse, have to originate in the House of Representatives. But laws that don't directly deal with money, I believe, can originate in the Senate. So I think Tom is mistaken about that. Similarly, striking down all or parts of laws or creating policies out of whole cloth, like, quote, presidential immunity, unquote, is an authority that is also only given to Congress by the Constitution. There's not a single word in the entire document authorizing the Supreme Court to do such things, as I've said often on this show. In 1803, in the case of Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court took onto itself the limited power to strike down laws which they believed conflicted with the Constitution. President Thomas Jefferson was horrified, writing to his old friend, Virginia Supreme Court Justice Spencer Rowan, quote, if this opinion be sound, then indeed is our Constitution a complete, but fellow to say, a suicide pact. For intending to establish 3 departments, coordinate and independent, that they may check and balance one another, it is given, according to this opinion, to one of them alone the right to prescribe rules for the government of the others, and to that one, too, which is unelected by and independent of the nation. Quote again, the Constitution on this hypothesis is a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form they please, unquote. But even at that, the 1803 Marshall Court didn't try to create new law out of thin air like the 6 Republicans on the court did last month when they created a brand new, never before seen or considered doctrine of presidential immunity. Even Chief Justice Roger Taney, and the correct pronunciation is Taney. I know it's spelled as Taney, but the pronunciation is Taney. Roger Taney's 1856 Dred Scott versus Sanford decision, which declared that every black person, even in the North, should become the property of a white person, which President Lincoln explicitly chose to ignore, was grounded in references to the Constitution's original protections against slavery. And Lincoln not only did ignore that, but of course he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves. So he repealed Dred Scott by himself. Similarly, Chief Justice Morrison Remick Waits, unquote, 1866 comment reproduced in the headnote to the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad case, which later courts exploited to grant, quote, personhood, unquote, to corporations, as I examined at length in my book Unequal Protection, How Corporations Became, quote, people, unquote, was based in the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment. And those were the 2 single most egregious decisions of the entire 19th century. Arguably, the most controversial decisions of the 20th century were Brown versus Board and Roe v. Wade. Again, both were grounded in the Constitution itself, while the opinion, concurrences, and dissents in Trump versus the United States, the case giving Trump immunity for official acts, includes 219 references to the Constitution, quote unquote. The only direct quote used to justify giving the president immunity to commit crimes while in office is from Article 2, quote, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. Not a very convincing quote to justify presidential immunity, in my view, and certainly not in Tom's view either. Tom goes on, everything else is a twisting and perversion of previous cases, opinions, and the meaning of executive power, unquote. The 6 Republican justices pulled this doctrine, allowing for a criminal presidency, out of their own backsides. Couldn't agree more, but I wouldn't be as polite. It is absolutely no basis in law, history, or the Constitution. As Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote in her defense, today's decision to grant former presidents criminal immunity reshapes the institution of the presidency. It makes a mockery of the principle foundational to our constitutional system of government that no man is above the law, and no woman either, by the way, quote, relying on little more than its own misguided wisdom about the need for, quote, bold and unhesitating action, unquote, by the president. The court gives former President Trump all the immunity he asked for and more, because our Constitution does not shield a former president from answering for criminal and treasonous acts. I dissent. Quote again, the court now confronts a question it has never had to answer in the nation's history: whether a former president enjoys immunity from federal criminal prosecution. The majority thinks he should, and so it invents an atextual, ahistorical, and unjustifiable immunity that puts the president above the law. Quote, yet again, argument by argument, the majority invents immunity through brute force. Under scrutiny, its arguments crumble. To start, the majority's broad official acts, quote unquote, immunity is inconsistent with text, history, and established understandings of the president's role. Moreover, it is deeply wrong even on its own functionalist terms. Quote, next, the majority's core, quote unquote, immunity is both unnecessary and misguided. Furthermore, the majority's illogical evidentiary holding is unprecedented. Finally, the majority's project will have disastrous consequences for the presidency and for our democracy, unquote. She notes that in Federalist 69, quote, Alexander Hamilton wrote that former presidents would be, quote, liable to prosecution and punishment in the ordinary course of law, unquote, adding that the Constitution gives limited immunity to Congress under the speech and debate clause, but there is no such guarantee for the president. This issue of keeping presidential immunity out of the Constitution was not an accident or oversight by the framers. It was debated at length during the Constitutional Convention in the summer of fall of 1787, and the delegates, including Hamilton, decided to omit any criminal immunity whatsoever for the president. As Sotomayor continues, quote, in sum, the majority today endorses an expansive vision of presidential immunity that was never recognized by the founders, any sitting president, the executive branch, or even President Trump's lawyers until now. Settled understandings of the Constitution are of little use to the majority in this case, and so it ignores them, unquote. In response to this bizarre decision, which the Republicans on the Supreme Court have forced on the American people, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has introduced the No Kings Act. The proposed law reverses the Supreme Court's grant of criminal immunity to Donald Trump and all president and future presidents as well, using the, quote, exceptions, unquote, clause of Article 3, Section 2, stripping from the court the power to reverse or even rule on the law. So, bless Chuck Schumer for introducing this act. And by the way, this is an example of an act that can be introduced to the Congress by the Senate and not by the House of Representatives. So there it is. Okay, a concrete example of a law that originates in the Senate. And why can it originate in the Senate? Because it is not a money law in any sense. Okay, and there again, there's the use of Article 3, Section 2 So the Congress knows how to use Article 3, Section 2, stripping jurisdiction from the Supreme Court when it wants to use it. We have seen very little use of it, in recent years. But here, Chuck Schumer knew that it was important enough to use the exceptions clause to prevent the Supreme Court from reversing or even ruling on this law. It is supported by more than half the Democrats in the Senate. Not nearly enough. It should be reported. It should be supported by every Democrat in the Senate, along with independents, Bernie Sanders and Angus King. Not a single Republican had the courage or patriotism to sign onto it. Call your two senators and the House member who represents you and demand passage of the No Kings Act and legislation to get the corrupt Republicans on this run-amok court under control. As Justice Sotomayor wrote, quote, "With fear for our democracy, we must all dissent." I thought that was a great column by Tom, except for small minor aspects. I entirely agree with it. It's great for him to call for passage of the No Kings Act. It was great for Schumer to write, the No Kings Act. And we need to campaign with our two senators and our House member to pass that act. To pass that act while Joe Biden is still president. And if it can't get through the Congress before the end of the year, we need to be there when the new Congress takes office on January 3rd so that they pass the No Kings Act right then and there. Of course, it would be fruitless for them to pass it if Donald Trump, if they do pass it before January 20th, Joe Biden could still sign it and remove the immunity from Donald Trump before he takes office, which, by the way, if he does get elected, it would be an essential thing for the Congress to do. Why? Because the mix of Donald Trump's obvious desire for dictatorial powers, quite easily inferred based on things that he said. For example, when he said he wanted to be dictator on the first day that he was president. And then when he said to people, you only have to vote for me once this time. Afterwards, you won't have to come out to vote at all. That is an explicit statement of his desire to make this a dictatorship. You combine that desire with Project 2025 and with the presidential immunity doctrine, and it greases the way for Trump to become a dictator. This is a clear and present danger now to anyone who is considering voting for Trump. And it should have been a key consideration in Robert Kennedy's deciding to endorse Trump. I think the guy has broken under the pressure of the campaign and the extremely unfair Democratic Party tactics that were employed against him. I think something has happened to him psychologically. I can understand how he might have gone off the deep end psychologically, because after doing all this work to be on the ballot in all 50 states, they come up with this New York suit that he's not a resident of New York, which he claimed to be, in order to take him off the ballot in New York State. And then in Pennsylvania, they also claim some technicality to get him off the ballot in Pennsylvania. And then they shift also the venue of the case to Harrisburg at the last minute. So when he arrives in Philadelphia, he has to go to Harrisburg, and he's 1 hour late for the trial. and can't even testify at the trial to take him off the ballot in Pennsylvania. I mean, when he's faced with crap like that, I understand why he's going crazy. But I urge you to note that he has definitely gone crazy in supporting Trump, given what I just have told you. I mean, dictatorship is imminent if Trump gets reelected. It's imminent. Anyway, that's what I have to say, okay, on that one. I will now look at your comments before I go to the final one. Well, Brandy, if she changes her tune, comes out strongly against, okay, the genocide, I think the Palestinian Americans will come home. Because why would they not? Would they rather see Trump, okay, in the presidency? I mean, all the worse for them. What Trump wants to do is to complete the ethnic cleansing and the genocide quickly, more quickly than they're doing it now. What do they gain, okay, by that? Steve says Trump will slaughter Kamala, okay, in the debate. Maybe so, Steve, but I don't think so. I don't think so. I think she's going to slaughter Trump. Sandy says, yuck, and says Trump is so gross. He's not just gross. He wants to be a dictator, and he has the tools right now, or will have the tools if he wins, to be the dictator.
And he warned people.
So, if you want a dictator and a full-blown fascist regime, then vote for him. And I know the Democrats have been real lousy when it comes to free speech. I'm aware of the suppression of free speech. I'm aware of what they've been doing to Julian Assange, or what they were doing till recently to Julian Assange. I'm aware of what they're now doing to Scott Ritter. I deplore it all. But still, most of us have our freedom of speech and have our freedom of the press. And there's no dictator sitting in the White House, okay, today. And there won't be if Kamala becomes the president also, I should say Kamala. Cut paste, says Lana. The United States Constitution was ratified on June 21st, 1788. Thank you, Lana, for reminding me of the history. When New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify it, this made the Constitution the official framework, okay, of the United States. Oh, yes, and George Washington was elected president actually in 1789, and he was the president from 1789 to, I think, 1797, when John Adams took over as the second president of the United States. Steve Wolfbrand says, good night, Kay. Steve Wolfbrand. Sandy Degg says, good night, Kay. Oh, yeah, thanks, honey. Okay, Bonnie was reminding me that
It's next to your chair.
I have to take my pills, so thank you, honey. So, Evelina says, I agree. He's not the only one. I'm not sure what you're agreeing with, though, Evelina, so. If you will be a little more explicit. Evelina says, wish he were. Steve Wolfbrand accuses me of Trump derangement uh, um, syndrome. Steve, I hate to pull rank on you, but this time, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm a PhD in political science. My explicit area of my PhD was about the rise of totalitarian regimes and the transitions from democratic regimes to totalitarian regimes. I wrote part of my PhD thesis on this. I studied the history of this for years and years and years. I know the symptoms. I know how people react. I know how dictators consolidate their powers. I know how fascists consolidate their powers. I don't have Trump derangement but syndrome. You have Trump derangement but syndrome in the other direction. You don't understand that Trump will establish a dictatorship under current conditions. I am predicting it.
He warned people.
And Barney says he has warned people. Yes, he has. And Sandy says Kennedy has lost his marbles. All Bobby's money was going to bogus Democrat lawsuits. That's true. But before Bobby nominated Shanahan as his vice president, he damn well should have gotten a commitment from her for $75 million in contributions to his campaign, because he needed the $75 million to fight those lawsuits and to fuel a small dollar donation campaign that would get him $500 million. Bobby wasn't smart enough to do that, Steve. He wasn't smart enough to do that, to exact a price from her. He was fuzzy about it. Okay, in the event, she only spent $10 million on this campaign. That was not enough. His security people spent $10 million on the campaign. One of his Republican donors, Timothy Mellon, donated $20 million. And his vice presidential candidate, who's a billionaire or near a billionaire, couldn't come up with $75 million. He shouldn't have appointed her vice president. Jesse Ventura said at the time he should have nominated him for vice president. Indeed, in the event, I'm sure Jesse Ventura was right, because at least he would have had much more votes come to his side if he had nominated Jesse Ventura as his vice president, and they might have been able to kick off a small dollar donation campaign. So it's clear, that he made a big mistake, in nominating Nicole Shanahan. Now, in saying this, I have to admit that I like that young woman very much. I think she's a good egg, and she's very bright, and she would be very competent after a while as a vice president of the United States. But he didn't get what he needed from her. And that's because he didn't have the guts to ask for it. Sandy Deck says, "Hi, Bonnie." And Duck says, "Love this deep stuff." Thank you, Duck. I was responding, even when it says, to Sandy's comment on Trump's grossness, laugh out loud. Oh, okay. Sandy says, "Don't mess around with Dr. Joe." Evelina says, Sandy's Cowboy Kitty says, "Hi, everybody." Duck said, "Listen to most of the show. No derangement detected by Mr. F. Now that Steve guy clearly has issues. Good night, Mr. F. I hope to catch you again." Okay, Duck, that's fine. Actually, though, I want to emphasize Steve is one of my friends. Okay, so I may disagree with Steve on various things, but Steve is certainly my friend. even though he calls me. He often calls me on the carpet for TDS. Cowboy Kitty said, Steve, and waved at Steve. Okay. I'll take those pills now. By the way, thank you for this discussion. It's been very good so far. I like discussions like this. So now let's get to the final one for tonight, the final piece for tonight. I'm not going to postpone it. I'm going to do it. This is a very notable piece by two of the best economists in the United States. It's from the Boston Globe, which normally I don't get to because of a paywall around it. But the title of the piece is Harris's Fight Against Price Gouging is Good Economics. The idea that prices serve to balance supply and demand and should be left free to do so is bred in the bone of economists, so much so that facts barely matter. The two great economists are James K. Galbraith, the son of John Kenneth Galbraith. Okay, it's James Kenneth Galbraith in this case, and Isabella Weber. Okay, Jamie has been one of America's great economists, or political economists actually, but since the 1980s, and is still one of our finest economists. Okay, and Isabella Weber is an outstanding young economist who's written, a wonderful book on China, and who is a rising star, in economics. Former President Donald Trump has called Vice President Kamala Harris, quote, full communist, unquote, for her attacks on price gouging. Okay, now, first of all, people who say Donald Trump is not a liar, that's an instance of someone being a full-out liar. A full-out liar. You don't call a person a communist for attacking price gouging. Not unless you're an effing liar. Jason Furman, I know it's all in good fun in politics to charge people with being communists or socialists or other smears. It may be good fun, but it's a lie. It's not a lie to say that Trump is a fascist, but it's a lie to say that Harris is a full communist. In fact, she's an effing neoliberal, if anything. For her attacks on price gouging, Jason Furman, a Harvard professor and an idiot, says her anti-gouging proposals are, quote, not sensible, unquote. Big things are clearly at stake: the election and the very sanctity of textbook economics. But Jamie is one of those against textbook economics. He doesn't write textbooks. At least I'm not aware of any that he has written. He's written some very good books on economics, but none that are textbook economics. There is one textbook economics I can recommend to you, and that, is macroeconomics, which was written by Bill Mitchell and Randy Way and Martin Watts. And that particular textbook is the MMT textbook on economics. And the MMT textbook is not against price gouging and do something about price gouging. Far from it. The idea that prices serve to balance supply and demand and should be left free to do so is bred in the bone of economists, so much so that facts barely matter. Thus, on August 15th, Furman told the New York Times, quote, egg prices went up last year. It's because there weren't as many eggs and it caused more egg production. Genius, right? Absolutely genius. There weren't as many eggs, and it caused more egg production. In fact, U.S. egg production peaked in 2019 and then fell slightly through last year. But egg prices spiked from early 2022 to, uh, sorry, I think I just got put behind the paywall, unfortunately. Let me see if I can get back to where I was. Yes, I did get back to where I was. I think I escaped the paywall for the time being. I better be careful with my cursor here, or I will end up behind it again. So, in fact, U.S. egg production peaked in 2019 and then fell slightly through last year. Egg prices spiked from early 2022 to $4.82 a dozen on average in January 2023 before falling back again with no gain in production. So they fell back again even though there was no gain in production. High prices uh, uh, did not stimulate America's hens to greater effort. On these points, Furman laid an egg. Here's a better story. 2022 was the year of peak cost increases in feed and fuel. Egg prices surged because costs did. Production then dropped again, partly due to avian flu. It has since begun to recover. When feed and fuel prices receded in 2023, egg prices came down. Have egg farmers gouged the public? In 2022, as recently alleged, or before, oh God, come on, AVG, get out of my face. 2022 is recently alleged or before, yes, they have. A jury has ruled in a conspiracy of the big players from 2004 to 2008 by exporting eggs and culling flocks, creating a scarcity they could exploit. But many small producers were not directly involved. They valued their reputations, their customer relations, and they know that if they overprice, someone else may undercut them. Eggs, after all, are not very different from one hen to the next. Most businesses, most of the time, are like the honest egg farmer, but some do gouge the public some of the time. Companies that use eggs have invested heavily in branding, packaging, and ads to distinguish their mayonnaise or pasta from the field. When the price of eggs goes up, those firms, quote, take price, unquote, as they say on their earnings calls, meaning they jump on the chance to raise prices and count on their competitors to do the same so that everyone can protect their margins. But when egg prices fall, they're in no rush to bring prices down, and so they reap, a windfall. Drug companies are notorious for gouging, especially if the bill is picked up by insurance companies or Medicare. That is why drug prices must be controlled and are in most countries. In 2021, Texas oil producers, many owned by private equity, had a field day as demand recovered while supply uh, uh, um, has lagged. I seem to have lost the thread here a minute. It was a deliberate business strategy reported in the local press at the time, and prices and profits soared. That is why it was good policy for SEALs from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to knock oil prices back down. Good policy on the part of the Biden administration. Landlords are a mixed lot. Some gouge while others do not. Here again, private equity is rapacious, buying up homes to rent at premium prices. That is why rent stabilization is needed. That is to say, rent controls, maybe rent controls. Most of the time, price gougers are exceptional and can be dealt with case by case. But there are moments when gouging becomes the rule. If basic costs spike as they did in 2021, 2022, business plans are disrupted. Uncertainty and fear take hold. Some businesses will react by raising their margins because they can without sticking out. Their goal may be to lay in a cushion in case costs jump even more. Others may take advantage, as the big egg companies did, to get what they can. But then their customers are squeezed, and a scramble for margins ripples through the supply chain. That is when general price controls or guidelines can help. In 1962, then President John F. Kennedy had achieved nationwide wage and price restraint with guidelines accepted by the most powerful trade unions in steel, automobiles, and rubber. Roger Bluff, I'm not sure whether he pronounced his name as Bluff or Blau, the head of U.S. Steel, busted the deal with a major price hike. Kennedy forced him to back down. Kennedy was right about that, and Harris is right about going after price gouging now. Harris's policy is popular. That is a sign that Americans still have some common sense. That is a good thing. It shows that all of the efforts of free market economists to beat it out of them have not yet worked. That is a magnificent short article by Jamie Galbraith, and Isabella Weber. It is a very commonsensical article, but it is very true to the facts. It doesn't ignore the facts. It cites the facts. It tells the truth. James K. Galbraith teaches economics at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, at the University, of Texas. Isabella Weber is associate professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, that division of the University of Massachusetts, by the way, whose economics department is a post-Keynesian economics department, and it's one of the best economics departments in the United States, in my view. So there it is. I hope you enjoyed that piece and my commentary on it. I think it's really a great piece. Now, I will take your comments. Kamala Harris says, someone with the name of Kamala Harris says all these sounds as if it's Muslim. I might have to invade it. Well, Kamala, that is very funny. But all the okay, is a German supermarket firm that came to the United States when, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago. We occasionally shop there. We also shop at another German supermarket firm known as Lidl, Lidl. They also have some good things there. Steve Wolfbrand says, use your eggs to throw at Kamala. Kamala Harris says, Kamala, I'm a Pokemon hybrid bitch. Not sure what that means. Aldi and Trader Joe's are owned, but brothers. One owns Aldi and one owns Trader Joe's. Yes, I think that's right. Oh, by the way, I shop at Trader Joe's too. We love Trader Joe's. It's our main store for shopping these days. Steve Wolfbrand says, Doc, Trump had 4 years to make himself a dictator, but didn't do it. Please explain. He didn't have control of the institutions then. That's why he wasn't able to make himself, a dictator. He had control, of the Senate. He didn't have control of the House, remember? He lost control of the House in 2019. By 2019, he no longer had the power, to make himself, a dictator. And his attorney general wouldn't even have gone along with it. He had a lot of opposition to making himself a dictator inside the government. As he himself says, he did not have the loyalists with him for his first term. His desire to become a dictator was manifest, by his attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 election and his naked attempt, to get his vice president to refuse to certify the result, and his exhortation to his supporters, to march to the Congress and to fight hard to overturn that very election. And all the lawsuits that he stimulated from the day after the election until the election was finally certified. Not one of those lawsuits was won. Not a single one was validated by the courts. That's why he wasn't able to make himself, a dictator. But if he takes control of both houses of Congress and he wins the presidency now, he has a blueprint in Project 2025 and in a decision just made by the Supreme Court, the presidential immunity decision. He has a blueprint to make himself a dictator. He didn't have that blueprint before. And he's not a very good planner himself. He's not able just to seize power and to plan how to consolidate it. But now he has a blueprint and he has a court decision that allows him to commit crimes without fear or favor. You add those things to his desire to become a dictator, which he has amply signaled, and the chances are, this time, that he'll be able to become a dictator. That's my explanation. Anybody here in California, please support Proposition 33, better known as the Justice for Renters Act, which will cause a lot more housing units to be under rent control. Great idea, Robert. I support Proposition 33. Sandy Degg, their company home base in Germany, right? Aldi and Lidl. Aldi's makes you put a quarter in their shopping cart so people don't steal them. They spent millions to prevent a few thousand in theft. Well, I don't know if it was a few thousand in theft. I have no way of evaluating whether that's true. But
Interesting.
uh, I don't mind really putting a quarter in, but I have to admit, I usually don't buy enough there to require a shopping cart. So what I do is I go in with a few shopping bags, I fill them, take them to the cashier, and check out. So I never really need a shopping cart there because I don't buy enough there to warrant a shopping cart. Steve Wolfbrand says, okay, Robert, I will do that. Sandy says they're based in Germany. The cashier will give you a quarter if you don't have one, Kamala. But Germany, what did Kamala say? I skipped that. Not known for invading. And Lana says, I'm glad someone is talking about price controls, even if temporary, may not be temporary. Lana says, Lord knows the Fed raising the rates hasn't done the trick. Just help people like me lose their jobs. Robert says, we have Trader Joe's, but not an Aldi store in Sacramento. Well, in the suburbs of D.C., close to Ashburn, Virginia, where I live, we actually have two Lidl stores, okay, in Ashburn. And we have, where are the two Aldi stores? There's an Aldi store in Sterling. Oh, yeah, there's an Aldi store in Ashburn and there's one in Sterling. And both are, within easy distance of our home. So we have two Aldi stores to go to. There's an Aldi store that's pretty much across the street from the Lidl store in Broadlands, Virginia, which is part of Ashburn. He says, Trader Joe's, I like them too. And Kamala says, I'm literally Kamala, fused with the Pokemon Kamala, a koala Pokemon that's always asleep. It's a genius concept, and most people have no idea what's going on. Sorry, which is a genius concept, Kamala? Cecil, so you're saying Congress would have to vote him dictator? I don't get it. What I'm saying is that Congress would have to avoid impeaching him if he tried to become a dictator in his first term. Then perhaps enough senators would have gone over to allow the attempted impeachment of him to get through. Nor did the Supreme Court guarantee his immunity from crimes at that time. So there were constraints on him. There were constraints in his own cabinet in terms of people not willing to follow him if he tried to declare himself a dictator. No, Congress didn't have to vote him a dictator. There's no voting involved. It's a question of his willingness to seize power. Kamala says, are the kitty emojis confusing you to who I am as well? Sandy Deck says it's frightening. Robert says, I know Aldi is in Missouri, but never heard of Lidl or however you spell the store's name. It's Lidl. Okay, Lidl is the name of the supermarket chain. We have a lot of Lidls here in Northern Virginia. They've come here in force. They have more capital, okay, than Aldi. Generally speaking, they're a bigger store and are better supplied with products. They feature a lot of products, okay, from Europe. Import a lot of products, okay, from Italy, for example. and some from Germany as well. They're usually pretty big on seafood and have pretty good prices on seafood as well, but they get the seafood here, of course. Cowboy Kitty says, Aldi's is the shit though. Very good store that pays more, okay, than minimum wage. They do pay more, okay, than minimum wage. Here, Aldi pays $18, okay, an hour, which is still below, okay, a living wage, by the way. But it is up to $18 an hour, and I think Lidl pays as much or more. How is photoshopping her on a Pokemon with the same name not genius? I don't know. That may well be genius. Steve says, well, I have to get to bed. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, Steve. Have a very good night. Lana says, Lidl cut paste. Thank you, Lana. Lidl grocery store with supermarkets in Delaware, Georgia, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, offering healthy and fresh high-value products for a low price that will save you money, yes. Yes, they do have fairly low prices, not quite, more than competitive with Trader Joe's, generally competitive with Aldi in terms of price value, but generally have a better selection than Aldi, I would say. Okay, but I go to Aldi too. For example, the coffee, okay, at Aldi is very high quality and very, very well priced. Okay. That's an outstanding thing, okay, in Aldi. Also, they have a very good price on Argentine red shrimp, if you like those, which we do. Sadie says, good night, Steve. And Lana says, good night, Steve. And Dee says, good night, Steve. Dee is still here. Hey, Dee. And Cowboy Kitty is still here. And Evelina says, good night, Steve. Cowboy Kitty. Love you all. He's not hip. LOL. I guess you're referring to me. I'm sorry about that, Cowboy Kitty. I'm not hip about certain things. That's certainly true. Robert Copeland says, cheapest store where I live, okay, is Grocery Outlet. I don't think we have a grocery outlet here. It may well be cheapest store. I think they have it where my daughter lives in Los Angeles, and I think she shops there. Okay, and she really likes it. Sandy says, Aldi has great chocolate. Yeah, so does Lidl. It has great chocolate too, but Trader Joe's, okay, has great chocolate also. Cowboy Kitty says, yeah, I'm still here. You're good. Love you. Laugh out loud. Thank you, Cowboy. And Lauderdale says, I am a Whole Food snob most of the time, or Lund's Byerly's, which is a regional Minnesota thing. Yeah, I've never heard of of Lund's Byerly. We have Whole Foods here and Wegmans here as well, and both, okay, are very good. But we find these days we don't go to Wegmans or Whole Foods too often because we can get very good quality stuff at Trader Joe's, okay, and at Lidl's. But for example, if I wanted to buy Radicchio, I would be going to Wegmans or to Whole Foods. But I suffer without any Radicchio, I'm afraid. Cowboy says, Aldi's has banging crab dip. Yeah, I usually don't go for things for packaged items in the stores because I'm afraid of the artificial ingredients. So if I do a crab dip, usually I make it myself. Solana says, I like the Wegman. There are none in Minnesota. Yeah, some of the good chains haven't spread all over the country. Wegmans is a great store, though. It really is. Whole Foods is pretty good, too. but I don't think it has quite the variety, okay, of Wegmans. When you walk into Wegmans, okay, it's like a food palace. You have to be very careful about, okay, the prices. Uh, in the upstairs of the Wegmans and part of the downstairs, uh, uh, there are tables to sit at. In other words, you can buy things in the store and you eat at what is, virtually a restaurant. Okay. And the atmosphere is, generally very pleasant. It's a good place for coffee. They have food bars, okay, that are very good. Uh, there's one Wegmans here, okay, that has a seafood counter where people can go and eat, seafood such as mussels and stuff like that. And Lana says, I just discovered fresh thyme. Ah, good. Cowboy Kitty says, I love your hat. By the way, keep up the fight. I'm just clowning. Yeah, my hat is a red beret, okay, for Medicare for All. I'm a member of the Red Berets, okay, for Medicare for All. And I always wear the hat and sometimes remind people that it's, okay, for Medicare for All. Cowboy Kitty says, I'm a truck driver. It gets very lonely in here, but people like you keep me sane. Well, thank you, Cowboy Kitty. I certainly appreciate that. So thank you, everyone. Actually, my attendance has grown this final hour. I'm happy to say we were at 15, 16, 17 people earlier, but we're now at 24 people. So that is, certainly very encouraging. I will be back on Tuesday. I'm now running a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday schedule. My regular schedule is 4 nights a week, and I also go on D's shows very frequently. I'll probably be going on D's show on Tuesday. Usually, when D has a show on Thursday, I'm also on her show on Thursday, but she hasn't been having a show on Saturday, so I'm not on her show. Okay. On Saturday, I cut out my Wednesday show for the time being because I need some time to get some other business done that I have to get done. This condition may last a few months, but sometime in the fall, I will be back to 4 nights a week, okay, or even more if my business deals, okay, should work out. But anyway, thank you for saying some nice things tonight. Okay, I appreciate everyone, even people who disagree with me from time to time, such as Robert, okay, and Steve, who is one of my very favorite people. So, also, thank you, Lana, for all the support, okay, tonight. Thank you, Sandy, okay, Evelina, Robert, Cowboy Kitty, um, uh, um, Kamala Harris, who added a light note, okay, to the proceedings. And that was very welcome. And thank you, Kay, for coming back again, at least for a limited amount of time. You were missed. Very definitely. And thank you, Duck, for coming. I've only seen you a couple of times, but anyway, thank you very much, Duck, for coming. Spread the word, like, share, and subscribe, of course. And occasionally visit my Buy Me a Coffee account and my Patreon.com account. And remember, you can make contributions, okay, at Patreon that are one-time contributions. All you have to do is sign up for a regular contribution, and then, 2 weeks later, delete it, or 1 week later, delete it, and you've made a one-time contribution. instead of a monthly contribution. That's really very easy to do. Thank you, Brandy, for being here tonight. I always enjoy it when you're here, okay, as well. Okay, and the Shoba Chomak Shuti, you were only here for a brief time tonight, I can tell, because you didn't make too many comments, but I appreciate, your attending. So thank you very much, everyone. And good night. Good night. Good night. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend, as Bonnie and I will have too. He said, good night, everyone. Great show. Also, Lana says, wow, Cowboy Kitty, that was a lovely thing to say. And Cowboy Kitty said, Lana, love you too. Lana said, Steve and Robert are salty, but good people they are. And Cowboy Kitty says, I'm Kamala, laugh out loud. Or Kamala, I should say. Saints says, have a great night, everyone. All 23 branches of macro bailing out of Argentina, since everyone was talking about stores. I bet they have great steaks down in Argentina, right? I can't eat steak anymore. It's not on my diet, but I did love a good piece of steak. Cowboy Kitty says, watch, unprompted tablet and phone, watching from, and Kamala says, F you, Kitty, stop making fun of me. Lana says good night. Evelyn says, a lot of families will be unemployed. Yes, in Argentina. Yeah, I know what's going on. Okay, in Argentina, absolutely opposed to Malay and what is going on here. He is only the latest, okay, in a number of governments that have been ruining Argentina, and that, of course, have been supported by the United States and by activities of the CIA, and also some of the NGOs who were tied in with the CIAs. So all that stinks. I hope that Argentina quickly gets another government, and that they take advantage of the invitation to join BRICS, because they really need BRICS. They really do. Okay. Kamala says, I love you, homie, but you're missing the forest, okay, through the trees. I don't know who homie is in this instance. Is homie Cowboy Kitty or is homie me? I don't know. But anyway, it is time for me to say good night. So again, thank you all for coming.